Welcome back to the radio. Tonight we'll be stepping inside a photo lab in 1995, where the air holds a faint mix of developer chemicals and yesterday's dust, and the hum of the processor is as steady as the hands that feed it. Here, every print is a tiny frozen square of time, pulled out of the shadows and into the light. You stand behind the counter, watching the slow ballet of paper, rollers, and drying racks, the kind of rhythm the world barely notices anymore. And of course, there's the occasional customer who insists you develop a floppy disk, as if it might bloom like a roll of Kodak gold if you just soak it long enough. So, what time is it on your side, and where are you tuning in from tonight? Leave a comment, and while you're here, subscribe to Quilloren Radio for more nights like this. Without further ado, let's begin. The key turns in the lock with the kind of faint resistance you've grown used to. The door has a stubborn streak, especially on damp mornings when the frame swells just enough to make you jiggle the handle. You push your way in, and the shop greets you with its usual chorus, the gentle whir of the dehumidifier in the back room, the faint hum of the fluorescent tubes overhead, and that distinctive scent that's equal parts photochemicals, cardboard film boxes, and the ghost of coffee from yesterday's mug. You leave the lights low for a moment, letting the shop stay in its half-awake state. The light that does filter in is the pale, slightly blue kind that comes through your front windows at this hour. The blinds are drawn halfway, casting neat stripes across the countertop, where the order forms wait in a stack. There's something satisfying about those forms, all blank except for the top sheet, which has the first job of the day scribbled in blue ink. 2 rolls, 3x5 gloss, double prints. You move toward the processor, running your fingers along its smooth, warm casing as you pass. It's still, for now, silent, except for the occasional click as its internal heating elements wake. You reach for the switch, and with a hum, the rollers begin their slow, steady spin. The machine smells faintly metallic when it starts up, like a toaster that's been scrubbed too many times. The air in here is cool from the overnight AC cycle, but not cold. There's just enough of a difference from outside that you can feel it settle on your skin, a thin layer of stillness. In the far corner, the enlarger stands where it always has, its long column casting a thin shadow on the wall. You've stopped thinking of it as equipment and more as an extra, silent coworker, the one who never moves, never talks, but somehow always looks like it's about to. A thin layer of dust glints on the unused stool beside the counter, catching the morning light. You wipe it with your sleeve out of habit, though you know no one will sit there. Customers tend to stand, leaning their elbows on the counter as they fish rolls of film from coat pockets or envelopes. You flip the closed sign to open with a quick motion, though you don't expect anyone for at least another hour. Most of your customers are creatures of habit. They come after errands, or on lunch breaks, or at the tail end of their workday when they've decided a fresh batch of photos might be a nice thing to have for the weekend. The first envelope of the morning is a small one, left in the drop box overnight. No name on the outside, just a roll of 24, exposure film wrapped in a grocery receipt. You slip it onto the counter and glance at the receipt out of curiosity. It lists 2 items, orange juice and cat litter. Somehow, it feels like enough to sketch a rough picture of whoever left it. You start your usual routine, checking the chemical levels, running a quick test strip through the machine, laying out the drying racks so the day's prints will have somewhere to land. The sound of the rollers pulling the paper through is steady and low, like a slow heartbeat. The counter bell, a small silver dome with a thumb-sized button on top, sits by the register. You've never actually heard it used in any normal way. People either smack it hard enough to make it sound like an alarm, or they poke it tentatively, producing a faint, apologetic ding. You've come to believe there's no middle ground. The light over the workbench flickers once as it warms, then steadies. You reach into the drawer for a pair of cotton gloves, white, slightly frayed at the edges, and slip them on before loading the first strip of negatives. The gloves feel slightly loose today, as if they've stretched from overuse, but you keep them anyway. There's something about their worn edges that's reassuring, like they've already absorbed years of slow mornings just like this. The shop feels suspended in its own time zone. Outside, you can hear the faint rush of cars passing now and then, but it's muffled by the glass and blinds. The real noise is in here, the steady hum, the occasional click of the enlarger's timer, the faint slosh from the wash tank. Halfway through setting up, you notice the doormat is slightly crooked. It's not the kind of thing that matters, but you straighten it anyway, stepping back to make sure it lines up with the frame. There's comfort in aligning small things when the rest of the world is shifting towards something you can't quite stop, the slow drift from film to digital, whispered about in trade magazines and hinted at by customers with new, shiny gadgets. You return to the counter, glance once more at the drop box, then at the quiet machine. Everything is ready. All that's left is for the day to happen at its own pace. There's a moment before the first frame comes through the processor where you can hear just the rollers, just the hum of the room. You stand there, listening to it, holding the empty space between one thing and the next. And, for a second, you wonder if the enlarger in the corner is listening too. The first strip of negatives slips from your gloved hands into the carrier with a faint, crisp sound, a kind of plasticky flutter that always reminds you of something else. It's not the film itself, but the way the edge clicks against the metal frame. That sound takes you back to another morning, years ago, when you worked in your very first photo lab. It was a smaller place than this one, tucked between a laundromat and a bakery that always smelled like rising dough and burnt sugar. Back then, the machine wasn't sleek or humming. It groaned like an old radiator, rattling slightly as the paper fed through. The chemical tanks were open tubs, so the smell was sharper, clinging to your clothes until you swore it seeped into your skin. You remember the first time you threaded a roll through on your own, your hands shaking just enough that you thought the entire thing might unravel like ribbon. The owner, a man named Glenn, stood nearby, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug that had "World's Best Fisherman" printed in peeling letters. He wasn't much for teaching. He preferred to watch and offer short advice, like, "Don't drop it," or "Try not to ruin the customer's memories." The shop was bright in the mornings, mostly because of the bakery's wide front windows next door. Sunlight would bounce off their stainless steel racks and pour through your doorway, making the dust motes visible in the air. It was the kind of light that made every speck of lint on the counter stand out, which meant Glenn kept a rag nearby at all times, wiping without ever really making things cleaner. There was a radio, too, not like the one you're speaking through now, but an old tabletop model with a dial that had to be nudged just right to catch the station. It sat on the shelf above the cutting board where you trimmed prints, quietly leaking soft rock into the room. Some songs stuck in your head for hours, especially the ones that seemed to play 3 times before noon. One particular morning stands out, not for any grand reason, but because it was the first time a customer ever handed you a roll of film directly, looking you in the eye as if to say, "These are important." She was a woman in her 50s, wearing a scarf tied neatly under her chin, and she had that patient politeness people used to carry into shops without thinking about it. The roll was warm from her hand. She didn't say much, only asked if you could make them look nice. You said yes, not realizing that was the whole job in 6 words. The smell of the chemicals in that shop mixed with the scent of baking bread drifting through the thin wall from next door. It was a strange combination. Warm yeast and cold fixer, and even then you weren't sure if it was pleasant. But it's a smell you still think of as belonging to mornings that start slowly and end without hurry. You remember the sound the paper made as it came out of the dryer, a faint, papery sigh, curling at the edges until you flattened it under your palm. You'd line up the prints, check them against the negatives, and slide them into envelopes with the customer's name written in your uneven handwriting. Glenn always said the handwriting mattered, because people liked to see proof a human was here. The gloves you wore then were tighter, newer, without the small phrase you've grown used to now. You'd snap them on with too much force, the sound cracking in the quiet room. Glenn would glance up from his mug, not saying anything, but somehow making you feel like you'd just startled the whole operation. Toward midday, the bakery's delivery truck would pull up, and the smell of fresh rolls would flood in as the driver propped the door open for a moment. Sometimes you'd wish customers could pick up their photos alongside a warm loaf, as if the combination might make them more eager to come back. The memory softens as it plays out in your head, the white tile floor, the hum of the open chemical tanks, the faded 1-hour photo sign in the window that only told half the truth. Most days it was closer to 2 hours, and no one seemed to mind. The days moved differently then, slower, with more pauses between moments. Back in the present, the hum of your current machine is steadier, the chemical smell fainter, the air cooler. The shop you're in now has no bakery next door, just a quiet insurance office with frosted windows. You glance toward the counter, where the Dropbox envelope still waits for you to open it. The strip of negatives in your hand catches the light just enough to flash amber, and you realize your grip has relaxed without you noticing. The sound of the rollers pulls you back entirely, a constant, low reminder that the work here hasn't changed as much as the world outside thinks it has. You slide the carrier into place and press the button, the machine responding with a soft, practiced whir. The past settles back into the edges of your thoughts, leaving only its residue, the scent, the warmth, and the faint idea that somewhere another shop might still smell like bread and fixer if you walked in at the right moment. The bell on the door makes its usual single note, not a ring, not a chime, just a short, metallic ding that sounds slightly impatient no matter who's pushing the door open. You look up from the enlarger to see Mr. Fisher, who has been dropping off film here for as long as you've been running the shop. He's in his late 70s, wears a beige windbreaker no matter the weather, and carries his film rolls in a heavy, duty sandwich bag, which he seals like it's classified material. "Morning," he says, placing the bag on the counter as if it might leak. "2 rolls. Don't cut them this time." You nod, knowing full well you've never cut his film in your life, but the request is part of his ritual. He leans on the counter, glances around the shop, and then asks, "Still using the same chemicals?" You tell him yes, and he says, "Good." The new stuff they use at that mall place makes everything look like it's from Mars. You don't ask how he knows. It's easier to let the thought hang there. He pays in cash, exact change, then leaves with a short wave. A few minutes later, the door opens again, this time for a woman you've only seen twice before. She's younger, maybe in her late 20s, with a tote bag patterned with camera lenses. She pulls out a single roll of film, hesitates, and then adds, "I think there's nothing good on it. I just didn't want to throw it away." You tell her that's as good a reason as any, and she smiles in a way that suggests she isn't sure if you're serious. As you write up her order, she asks, "Do people still print photos here a lot?" You say yes, but in a quieter way than people used to. She nods, glances toward the humming processor and says, "It's nice, though. I forgot what it sounded like." She pays, thanks you, and leaves, the bell giving the same single impatient ding. Around mid-morning, the insurance agent from next door stops in with a mug of coffee for you. He doesn't drink coffee himself, says it makes him feel like a moth, but every so often he buys one for you when he's already out running errands. You thank him and set it near the register, the heat curling faint wisps of steam into the air. He asks if business is steady. You tell him it's steady, like a parked car is steady. He laughs, the kind of laugh that's just one note higher than normal breathing, and says, "Well, at least you're not running out of space." Then he glances around at the shelves and adds, "Though you could be charging rent to half these empty spots." You say you'll consider it, even though you both know you won't. Near noon, a mother and her young son come in. She's holding 2 disposable cameras, the kind you wind with your thumb until it clicks. The boy places them on the counter himself, clearly instructed to do so. He peers at the enlarger in the corner and whispers, "Does that make the pictures?" You tell him no, it helps make them bigger. He frowns, as though this answer is deeply unsatisfactory, then looks to his mother for clarification she doesn't have. You fill out their order while the boy hums a tune you can't place. It has the rhythm of a commercial jingle, but none of the melody. When you hand the mother her receipt, she thanks you, and the boy says, "Bye, cameraman," even though you aren't holding a camera. After they leave, the shop is quiet again, except for the hum of the machine and the faint ticking of the clock above the doorway. You take a sip of the coffee, now lukewarm, and glance at the drying rack where the first prints of the day are curling slightly as they cool. Late in the afternoon, a man in work overalls stops in, holding a film canister in one hand and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper in the other. He sets the film down, takes a bite of the sandwich, and says, "Don't rush these." No one's in a hurry but the sandwich. You tell him you'll give the film the slow treatment, and he nods approvingly before heading out. The light through the blinds has shifted by the time you finish logging the day's orders. Each envelope on the counter has a name and a date, small proof that the shop is still a place people come to for the same reason they always did, to turn something unseen into something they can hold. You think about how these small interactions never really change. The faces shift, the questions vary slightly, but the rhythm is constant. A greeting, a handover, a few words, a payment, and a departure. It's the simplest kind of connection, built on the understanding that you'll take care of what they've given you. When the bell dings again, it's the mail carrier dropping off a small box of paper stock. She sets it on the counter, signs her own form with a quick flick, and says, "Still at it, huh?" You tell her you are, and she says, "Good." Some things ought to stay put. Then she's gone, leaving the door to swing shut slowly behind her. The shop holds the quiet again, the kind that makes the hum of the processor sound almost like breathing. You take another sip of the coffee, now gone cool, and set it down beside the stack of fresh envelopes. There's a comfort in knowing the day's conversations have already settled into the air, quiet and unremarkable, just part of the shop now. The hum of the processor has a way of loosening old memories, the kind that don't arrive all at once but seep in slowly, like light through a curtain. This time, it brings you back to the year before you ever set foot in a darkroom. Back then, you were working at a small bookstore, 2 towns over, the kind with narrow aisles and a register that liked to jam whenever it felt the conversation was getting too interesting. The store had a carpet that seemed older than the building itself, patterned in a faded red, and gold weave that made dropped pennies nearly invisible. The air always smelled faintly of paper, dust, and the lavender sachets the owner tucked between certain shelves, for ambience, which you suspected was her way of covering the scent of a ceiling leak in the history section. Most mornings began with the sound of the front door chime, not an electronic beep, but a literal bell that wobbled when someone pushed the door open. You'd nod hello, sometimes before you even saw who it was, because the regulars tended to arrive at the same time every day. A man named Carl always came in at 9:15, bought a newspaper, and told you whether the weather report was right. He was wrong about the report being wrong half the time, but it seemed important to him to keep score. You stocked shelves, straightened piles, and sometimes read the backs of books you had no intention of reading. The register sat near the front window, so you'd often watch people pass by without coming in, their reflections sliding across the glass like they were part of the display. One of your tasks was unpacking new shipments, which arrived in tall cardboard boxes bound with plastic strapping. You had a box cutter that stuck halfway through each slice, so every opening felt like an exercise in determination. The books would come out cold in winter, warm in summer, as if they'd absorbed the last stop of the delivery truck's route. The job was quiet, steady, and in its own way, just as repetitive as the photo lab, but there was no hum, no mechanical rhythm to anchor the day. Instead, there were the soft clicks of book spines, the faint thud of stacking hardcovers, and the occasional flutter of a page caught by the air from the ceiling fan. Some afternoons, you'd wander over to the magazine rack and skim photography journals without really knowing why they caught your interest. You weren't thinking about changing jobs. You weren't thinking about chemicals or processors or negatives. You just liked the way the photographs looked against the matte pages, the way light could be fixed onto paper in a way that words couldn't. The store owner, Mrs. Fitch, was a short woman with a sharp memory and an even sharper pencil. She ran the shop like a cross between a library and a living room. She noticed you lingering over the photography magazines one day and said, "There's a shop across town that does that. Pictures. You'd like it." You shrugged, because she was probably right, but you didn't think about it again for weeks. When you finally wandered into that shop out of curiosity, you didn't know it would be the place you'd work next. You just wanted to see what the inside looked like. The smell hit you first, sharper and cleaner than the bookstore, but layered in a way that made you think of metal and paper mixed together. A man behind the counter was trimming a sheet of photo paper with slow, even cuts, the blade sliding across a straight edge. He looked up, asked if you needed something, and you heard yourself say, "Just looking." You didn't notice until later that you'd stayed longer than necessary, watching the way the prints came out of the machine, damp and curling before they were flattened. Back at the bookstore, the thought of that other shop sat quietly in the back of your mind. It wasn't that you disliked your job. It was fine, dependable, and the customers rarely complained. But the idea of making something physical from something invisible felt like a different kind of work. When Mrs. Fitch mentioned one morning that she'd be closing the store in a few months, you nodded, already thinking of where you might go next. And that's when the idea stopped being just a thought. You returned to that photo lab, asked if they needed help, and left with a start date written on the back of a business card. Now, standing in your own shop, the memory has no weight to it. It doesn't carry regret or longing. It's simply a point on a line, a small turn that eventually led here. The bookstore smell is gone from your clothes, replaced by the faint, metallic sweetness of Fixer. The carpet under your feet is clean tile. The steady hum is the sound you measure your days by. You glance toward the door, half expecting the bell to ring, half expecting it to stay silent. Either way, the day will continue, frame by frame, print by print, as it always does. There is a drawer in the counter, third from the left, that sticks every time you try to open it. The others glide easily, their tracks smooth from years of use. But this one resists, as if it knows you're about to ask something of it. The wood is slightly warped from an old leak that dripped down behind the counter long before you took over the place. You learn the trick to opening it on your first week. Pull slowly, angle slightly to the right, then give it one decisive tug. Inside, the drawer is shallow, lined with black felt worn thin in spots. This is where you keep the envelopes that customers never came back for. Each one is labeled in your handwriting or in the handwriting of whoever was working at the time. Neat names and dates written in blue ballpoint on the paper flaps. Some of the envelopes are so old, the edges have begun to curl. The photographs inside have been waiting for years, sealed in darkness, their colors likely still vibrant in ways the customers might not expect. Every so often, when the shop is quiet, you slide the drawer open and thumb through the stack. You don't look inside the envelopes. That would feel wrong, like reading someone else's mail. Instead, you look at the names and imagine the stories that might be frozen in those frames. There's one from April 1992, marked Benson, Roll 3. You remember the man, tall, soft, spoken, always wearing a corduroy jacket even in summer. He brought in rolls of film steadily for months, then stopped without explanation. Another envelope is dated October 1994. The handwriting, not yours, but from your predecessor, a looping cursive you can't quite replicate. The customer's name is smudged, the ink blurred as if the pen hesitated on damp paper. The drawer holds more than abandoned orders. In the very back, behind the envelopes, there's a small tin that once held mints. Now it contains screws from the old enlarger, a brass key that no lock in the shop seems to match, and a scrap of paper with a phone number written in pencil. The number has no name attached. Sometimes, during long stretches without customers, you'll take the tin out and turn the objects over in your palm. They're not valuable, but they have weight. They are proof that the shop has lived through more days than you can remember, that hands before yours have made small decisions to keep or discard, and that these objects were chosen to stay. The counter itself is another anchor. Its surface is scarred with faint knife marks from when someone, years ago, used it as a cutting board for trimming mat prints. The laminate is chipped at one corner, revealing the pale wood beneath. You've thought about sanding it down, maybe replacing it entirely, but the wear feels honest, and you suspect a new counter would only make the rest of the shop look older by contrast. When customers stand at the counter, they rest their hands on it without thinking. Some tap their fingers while they wait for prints to emerge from the machine. Others lean forward to look at the order forms. Every mark on the surface is a kind of ledger, recording the weight of elbows, the drag of paper, the occasional spill of coffee that leaves a faint ring if you catch it in the right light. Behind the counter is your stool, not particularly comfortable, but adjusted to the right height so you can reach the machine's control panel without standing. The seat cushion is flattened in the middle, the vinyl cracked along one seam. On slow days, you sit there and watch dust motes drift in the light from the front window. They land on the counter, the floor, the edge of the open drawer, and you brush them away without looking, the motion so automatic it feels like part of breathing. The drawer, the counter, the tin, these are not just parts of the shop. They are the parts that stay still while everything else changes. New customers come in, old ones stop visiting, and the technology outside your door shifts in ways you can't quite keep up with. But when you pull that drawer open, when you set something down on the counter, when you feel the small weight of the tin in your palm, you are reminded that some things can remain fixed, even if only in the small radius of your own workbench. There's comfort in that. Even as the machines grow quieter for longer stretches, even as the envelopes in the drawer age without being claimed, the space holds. It doesn't need to be anything more than it is, a place that keeps what it's given. And perhaps, in its own way, it keeps you too. If you've been enjoying the quiet of this evening in the photo lab, consider subscribing to Quilloren Radio so you can return any time. There's always another night, another story, and another place where the world slows down long enough to notice the little things. You've never spoken much about it, but tucked away in the quieter corners of your mind is the image of a place you almost built. Not a shop like this exactly, but something a little larger, a little warmer, with wooden shelves and a wide display wall where prints could live like art. You imagined customers wandering in not just to collect their envelopes, but to linger, to sit on a couch with a cup of tea while their film ran through the processor. A kind of studio, gallery hybrid, where photographs weren't just transactions, but conversations. In your version, the floor would be scuffed hardwood, each plank carrying the creak of footsteps. There'd be light, real daylight, streaming in through high windows, the kind that makes colors richer without effort. The air wouldn't be heavy with chemicals alone, but with the faint scent of brewed coffee and warm paper. You'd host little exhibitions maybe on Friday nights, where people would stand around holding prints and sharing the stories behind them. You'd hang them from clips on thin wire so they could sway slightly when someone walked by. You had even sketched the layout once. The dark room would be tucked away behind a sliding door, soundproofed enough so the gentle conversations in the front wouldn't be interrupted by the whir of machines. You'd keep the front space open and uncluttered, a far cry from the tight aisles of this shop. In your drawing, the counter was shorter and more inviting, with a display case beneath it holding small photo books you had either made or sourced from local artists. It's not that you dislike the shop you work in now. It's small, yes, and has its quirks, a leaky tap in the back, a door that only latches if you pull it twice, and a carpet with a stubborn ripple that's been tripping customers for years. But this place was never yours to shape. It's functional, not personal. You are a caretaker here, not an owner. The dream you had was about creating something that could grow with you. The idea came to you around the time digital cameras first started appearing in electronics store displays. They were expensive, clunky by today's standards, but people would gather around them in the mall as if they were strange artifacts from the future. You knew, even then, that the business you loved was about to change. That's probably why the dream studio never happened, because deep down, you didn't want to build something that might only last a few years before the tide of technology swept it away. But even now, in 1995, you can't help but wonder what would have happened if you had tried anyway. Would you have carved out a little corner of the city where people still wanted to see their images printed on real paper? Would it have survived long enough to make a living, or would it have become another quaint memory folded up and put away? You imagine what it would feel like to walk into that space each morning, to arrange freshly printed photos along a table in the front, knowing each one would soon be in someone's hands. To hear the click of the door and see a regular customer step inside, carrying a roll of film they shot over the weekend. You picture yourself talking with them not just about the prints, but about the places they'd been, the light they'd chased, the moments they'd tried to keep. In your mind, there's a shelf in the back holding boxes of cameras. Not the latest models, but solid, dependable film cameras that could be rented out to anyone wanting to try photography for the first time. Maybe there's even a small community darkroom in the basement, where you could teach people how to process their own film, the smell of developer and fixer becoming part of their memories too. It's a nice thought, but like so many nice thoughts, it hangs in the air a moment before drifting away. You return to the hum of the machines here, the cramped counter, the stack of envelopes waiting to be sorted. The dream isn't gone, not entirely. It just sits quietly in the background, like an undeveloped roll of film holding its images in the dark. Sometimes, late at night when the shop is closed, you catch yourself leaning on the counter, staring at the faint reflection of the room in the glass display case. You can almost see the other shop layered over this one, your shop, the one you never built. The details are blurry now, as if your mind is losing the negatives. But the feeling is still there. That feeling of having something to pour yourself into, not because it was practical or profitable, but because it was yours. You let yourself linger there for a while, in that imagined space, before the thought fades and you turn back to the present, where the real prints are still sliding out of the machine, one after another, each one carrying a story for someone else to tell. It began as a passing idea, something you almost didn't act on. One slow Tuesday afternoon, with no customers in sight and the machine quietly churning through a single batch of film, you noticed an empty cardboard box sitting under the counter. It had once held packs of glossy paper, now long used up. You reached for it without much thought, pulled it onto the counter, and wondered what it might hold if it were more than just trash. The thought came quickly, a time capsule. Not a grand one, buried deep in the ground for a century, but a humble, personal one, a box to seal away small moments from the shop before they slipped away entirely. You didn't have a specific audience in mind. Maybe no one would ever open it but you. Maybe someone else would find it, long after you were gone. That uncertainty made it better somehow. You began with what was around you. In the drawer under the counter, you found a strip of rejected prints, misaligned by the machine. The photos were incomplete, only halves of faces or parts of buildings, but there was a strange poetry to them. You placed them in the box first. Then came a pair of plastic film canisters, one black, one gray. They were empty, but you knew the weight of them. The satisfying click of the lid when closed was part of the era you lived in. From the shelf in the back, you took one of the small paper envelopes you'd been using for years. On its surface, you wrote the date in pencil, along with the words, "For whoever finds this." Inside, you placed a single 4:6 print you'd made earlier that morning when testing the printer, a photograph of the shop itself, captured in the reflection of the display case. You figured that if nothing else survived, someone would see what the place looked like from the inside. You started to add stranger things. A handwritten receipt from 3 years ago with a total of 85 pesos scrawled at the bottom. A small stack of unused, ready-for-pickup tags. Even a slice of the carpet, carefully cut from the frayed corner near the back door, the one everyone tripped over, because it had been part of the shop's personality for longer than you could remember. But it didn't feel finished. Not yet. The next day, you decided to take it further. Each time a customer came in, you watched for something that could fit into the box, a fragment of their story. If a photo order came back with 1 or 2 prints that the customer didn't want, you asked if you could keep them. Most didn't mind. You were careful about what you chose. Never anything too personal, just images that carried a sense of time. A bicycle leaning against a sorry store. A cloudy sky over a rice field. A birthday cake with sparklers, frozen mid-flicker. By the end of the week, the box had weight. It was becoming something more than scraps. It was starting to feel like a record, not of big historical events, but of ordinary life. the kind that slips by unnoticed until someone decides to save it. There was one last thing you wanted to include. In the bottom drawer of the counter was an old notepad where you'd been jotting customer requests, quick sketches of print layouts, and reminders about maintenance. It was years old, with ink that had begun to fade. Some pages were stained from coffee, others smudged with developer. Flipping through it, you saw the daily rhythm of the shop written in your own rushed handwriting. Dates. Names. Occasional doodles in the margins. You tore the whole pad from its binding and placed it in the box without rereading too closely. The little details would speak for themselves. You sealed the box with packing tape, then found a thick black marker and wrote across the top. Photo Lab Time Capsule, 1995. Do not open until you're ready to remember. For a long moment, you stood there with it in your hands, unsure where it belonged. In the end, you slid it onto the highest shelf in the storage room, behind stacks of old display posters. You didn't mark the spot. You didn't even tell anyone it was there. It wasn't meant to be a statement or a protest against the changing world. It wasn't an attempt to stop time. It was just a quiet offering to the future, in case the future ever cared. Over the next few days, you almost forgot about it. You went back to processing rolls, labeling envelopes, listening to the low hum of the shop's machinery. But every so often, your gaze would drift toward the storage room, and you'd think about that box, resting in the dark, holding pieces of now. Part of you wondered who might open it someday. Would it be someone who remembered what a roll of film felt like in their hands? Or would it be a person born into a world of digital screens, who had never smelled photochemicals or waited a week to see their pictures? The truth was, you didn't know. And that was fine. The box was safe, for now. Like an undeveloped negative, it would wait. You rest your hands on the countertop, feeling the faint, worn grain of the wood beneath your palms. The shop is quiet, except for the low, unchanging hum of the machines in the back. It's the kind of sound you hardly notice when you're busy, but now, in the stillness of the late afternoon, it's all you hear. The clock on the wall ticks with a deliberate slowness, and the air smells faintly of photochemicals, a scent you've come to associate with time itself. Your eyes drift to the corners of the shop, places you've walked past thousands of times without really looking. There's the little spot near the door where the floorboards squeak, no matter how carefully you step. The section of wall where the paint has dulled, almost like it has absorbed the years of light spilling through the glass. The row of paper boxes along the shelf, each labeled in your handwriting, though some labels have begun to fade. You find yourself imagining what this place might look like 30 years from now. Maybe it won't be a photo lab anymore. Maybe it'll be a cafe, with soft music and chatter where the machines once stood. Maybe it'll be an office, with computer desks lined along the wall, and the faint hum replaced by the sharper, more urgent buzz of electronics. Or maybe it'll be empty, just four walls holding on to echoes no one can quite place. If someone were to walk through here in that far-off time, they might never know a photo lab had been here at all. They wouldn't know about the smell of fixer that lingered in the air, or the soft rustle of paper as you slipped each print into its envelope. They wouldn't know the way the afternoon sun poured through the front glass, laying warm rectangles of light across the counter. They wouldn't know how the shop felt in winter, when the air outside bit at your face and the inside seemed to hold the smallest pocket of safety in the cold. You glance at the old enlarger in the corner. It's heavy and stubborn, the kind of equipment that feels like it will outlast the walls around it. But you know better. One day, someone will look at it and see nothing more than a bulky, outdated machine. It might end up in a thrift store, sitting on a dusty shelf between a broken lamp and a stack of mismatched dinner plates. Or it could be hauled away as scrap, the last traces of the thousands of photographs it helped create dissolved into nothing. You shift your gaze to the photo processor. You imagine its parts dismantled, the rollers and tanks scattered into pieces, each one losing the shape it once held. In your mind, you hear the silence of this room without it. No steady hum, no occasional clatter of prints sliding through the final stage. Just emptiness. The thought makes you press your hands harder into the counter, as if you could anchor yourself to the present through touch alone. You try to take in every detail, the slight bend in the countertop's edge, the fine scratches near the cash register, the way a faint line of dust collects along the back shelf no matter how often you wipe it away. You think about the customers who have passed through this door over the years. Some came in smiling, eager to pick up their prints. Others arrived quietly, as though the contents of their envelopes were private even from you. They carried moments in their pockets, birthdays, weddings, vacations, ordinary afternoons, and you helped turn them into something they could hold in their hands. You wonder where all those prints are now. Some might still be framed on walls, others tucked into albums, others left in boxes and closets, their corners curling as the years go by. You imagine a time when no one prints photos anymore. Images might exist only in the glow of a screen, stored in invisible data clouds that no one touches. You picture people scrolling through decades of their lives with a flick of a finger, pausing only briefly before moving on to the next image. Will they linger the way people do when they hold a print? Will they notice the tiny details in the background, the things you didn't mean to capture but did anyway? Your mind drifts further, to a version of this shop as nothing more than a memory in your own mind. The smell, the sound, the weight of the envelopes in your hand, all of it locked away inside you. What happens when you're the only one who remembers? Does the place still exist in some way, or does it fade entirely when you're gone? You walk slowly toward the front of the shop, your steps quiet on the worn floor. Outside, the street is calm. A few people pass by, not looking in. You wonder if they'd notice if the shop disappeared tomorrow, replaced by a different name above the door. Maybe they'd walk past for weeks without realizing. You stand there a while, watching the light shift. The sun has dipped lower, casting longer shadows inside. The warmth of the afternoon begins to cool, and you know the day is tilting toward its end. Soon, you'll turn off the machines, flip the sign on the door, and lock up for the night. Before you do, you let your gaze sweep across the shop one last time. Every shelf, every mark on the floor, every object that has been here longer than you have. You try to take a mental photograph, one no camera could quite capture, of how it feels to be here now, in this exact moment. Because you know that in 30 years, when you think of this place, it won't be the exact layout you recall, or the exact light, or even the smell. It will be this feeling that you were here, that this was yours for a while, and that it mattered. You take a deep breath, letting the quiet settle in. And then you turn back toward the counter, ready to face the final hours of the day. The steady hum of the photo processor fills the shop, a sound so constant you hardly notice it anymore. But today, in the stillness between customers, you let your mind wander. You imagine the machine shifting, stretching, taking in a deep breath like it has been waiting years to speak. Its voice wouldn't be loud or mechanical, you think. It would be warm and slightly weary, like someone who has worked long hours without complaint. Another roll of sunsets, it might say with a sigh, as if it could already guess what was on the negatives before they passed through its rollers. You imagine leaning against the counter, arms folded, trading remarks with the processor as if it were a colleague. You might hand it a roll of film and say, "This one's from the couple who always takes pictures of their cats." The processor would hum a little louder, not in protest, but in anticipation. "Ah, yes," it would say, "the tabby with the green eyes. Always catches the light just right." Once the thought takes hold, you can't help but give it more life. You imagine it has seen so many lives through its narrow windows, birthdays, weddings, vacations, moments too ordinary to remember without a photograph. It might even develop preferences. Not another blurry concert, it could groan in mock exasperation, though you know deep down it would still work just as carefully, just as faithfully, with every single frame. And then your mind wanders further, past conversation, into the strange and magical. You picture coming in one morning to find the shop has shifted slightly overnight. Not in a way anyone else would notice, but in ways you feel immediately. The smell of the chemicals is lighter, touched with something sweet like vanilla. The enlarger in the corner has turned slightly, as though it had been watching the door, waiting for you. You imagine the shelves rearranging themselves to display envelopes of prints with the most vivid colors on top, as if the shop itself wanted to brighten your mood. The dust motes in the air might swirl into small shapes, a camera, a roll of film, a pair of spectacles, before settling back into randomness. You lean your elbows on the counter, smiling faintly at the thought. Maybe the bell over the door would ring once without anyone entering, just to let you know the shop is awake. Or perhaps you'd find the processor quietly turning over an unclaimed roll of film from years ago, deciding that today was the right day to finish it. Your daydream carries you further still. You imagine that each night, after you lock the door, the photographs left inside the envelopes step quietly out into the shop. They might wander the aisles, looking at each other with curiosity. A beach scene from the early 80s might compare notes with a winter portrait from last year. A child's birthday cake might chat with a snapshot of a quiet street at dusk. The images would never leave, of course. They'd return to their envelopes before dawn, their corners tucked neatly, no fingerprints or signs of movement. But you'd sense something different when you picked them up in the morning, a faint hum of life in the paper, a quiet echo of laughter or ocean waves if you held them just right. You imagine sitting in the darkroom late one evening, the safe light glowing red when the processor speaks again. "You know," it says, "these photographs, they're not really for the people who took them." You'd glance over, unsure what it means. It would let the pause linger, the steady hum filling the space between words. They're for the people they don't know yet, the ones who will find them years from now and wonder who these smiling faces were. The thought sends a small shiver through you, not unpleasant. It feels like a truth you'd always known, but never put into words. In your mind, you and the processor fall into a rhythm, like two people closing up a cafe together at the end of the day. You'd stack envelopes, it would hum and click, you'd sweep the floor, it would feed the last frames through the dryer. And maybe, on rare evenings when the world outside is quiet enough, it would tell you about the most beautiful photograph it ever developed. You decide it wouldn't be anything grand. Not a landmark or a famous person. No, it would be a photograph of something small, like the way light fell through lace curtains on a rainy afternoon, or the look between two people who didn't realize the camera was watching. Your gaze drifts to the processor now, silent except for its familiar hum. It's easy to imagine that if you stood here long enough, it might really speak. That the shop itself might really shift overnight. and you think that even if none of it ever happened, it's enough just to hold the possibility in your mind for a while. The doorbell chimes suddenly, breaking your reverie. You straighten up, letting the daydream settle back into the quiet corners of your mind. The shop looks exactly as it did before, still, ordinary, familiar. And yet, as you greet the customer and take the next roll of film, you can't help but think the processor hums just a little warmer than usual, as if it knows what you've been imagining. You turn the key in the lock, but you don't twist it just yet. The weight of the day sits in your hand, cool metal pressing into your palm, the ridges of the key catching on your skin. Behind you, the shop is already half in shadow, the last strips of fluorescent light stretching across the floor like pale ribbons. You stand there for a moment, just listening. The hum of the processor is softer now, the kind of sound that would be easy to miss if you weren't so familiar with it. You've heard it every day for years, always at the end of the shift, always with that steady content rhythm, as if the machine knows it has done enough for one day. The air feels different in the evenings, the faint chemical scent no longer sharp but mellowed, blending with the dry scent of paper. The prints from today are stacked neatly in their envelopes, waiting for tomorrow's hands to claim them. Some will be picked up with a smile, some with a shrug, and a few will linger in the drawer until they become part of the shop's quiet archive of forgotten things. You walk slowly to the counter, fingertips trailing over its edge, feeling the faint scratches carved into the laminate over the years. They're not just random marks to you. You remember the day a customer accidentally dropped their camera here, the metal leaving a shallow dent. You remember the time you leaned too heavily while filling out an order slip, and the pen tip pushed through the paper. These tiny scars belong to the shop, and in some small way, they belong to you too. Your eyes move toward the enlarger in the corner. Its shadow stretches long across the wall, taller than it looks in the daylight. You've seen that shadow so many times, but it always seems to change as the evening falls. You take a slow breath and imagine that it's watching you back, its quiet presence as much a part of closing time as your final walk through. You don't switch it off yet. There's a comfort in letting it stand there, lit for just a few minutes longer, as if the shop itself gets to linger awake before you put it to bed. The street outside is mostly silent. You can see faint shapes moving beyond the glass door. Someone walking home, someone locking up another store, a car passing slowly. The world outside is winding down in its own way, just as you are. You take a moment to lean against the doorframe and watch. Streetlights flicker on one by one, their glow mixing with the fading blue of the evening sky. You've always liked this part of the day, when the sharp lines between work and rest blur into something gentler. You start the familiar routine. The switches are in the same order they've always been. One click for the front lights, another for the sign. The shop darkens in layers, each sound from the switches a soft punctuation mark on the day. You walk toward the back, your steps echoing just slightly on the linoleum. The processor's hum fades as you power it down, the final word trailing off until there's nothing left but silence. The silence feels different now, fuller somehow. Without the hum, every small sound becomes clearer. The creak of the floor under your foot, the faint rattle of a loose vent in the ceiling. Even the sound of your own breathing seems louder in this kind of quiet. You stand still for a moment and let it wrap around you. You glance at the shelves one last time. Film canisters in their boxes, neatly stacked. Chemical bottles labeled in your own handwriting. A few order forms sitting in a tidy pile, waiting for tomorrow's pen. There's a simple order to it all. and you've learned to appreciate the comfort of things being where they should be. You flick off the last light. The shop is now only lit by the glow from the street outside, slipping in through the front windows in thin stripes. The machines are still, their outlines barely visible in the dimness. It almost feels like they're sleeping. You step to the door, key ready in your hand. This time, you twist it. The lock clicks into place with a sound you know by heart. You give the handle a gentle pull to make sure it's secure. Through the glass, you take one last look inside. The shadows have claimed the space, but you can still see the faint shapes of the counters, the machines, and the little notes stuck to the wall, reminders to yourself that no one else would understand. You turn away and start walking down the quiet street. The cool night air meets your face, carrying with it the faint scent of rain from somewhere far off. The rhythm of your steps matches the slow, winding thoughts in your head. You think about how many evenings you've done this exact walk, how many times you've locked that same door. You think about how tomorrow you'll do it all again. But for now, the day is over. The shop rests, and so do you.